Good Wednesday morning to you. As I continue to make my way through Exodus in my own personal devotional time, I was reminded in Exodus 20 and 21 and 22 and 23 how many laws exist. We frequently look at Exodus 20 as the giving of the Ten Commandments, but then God expounds on those, and this is what gives birth to the Mosaic Law, 613 laws that are designed to help God's people live as God's people. There's certainly a lot of detail in that, and as I was reading through it, I was reminded of how often we use, that one verse, that one law that was given to create horrible atrocities on other people. If you look at, just the history of who we've been for the last 2,000 years, there's a lot of misinterpretation in these couple chapters of Exodus that have brought forth this evil that has existed in the world. It's always fascinating to me when we use a verse to make an argument or to be the platform for something we desire to do, and yet we ignore big chunks of other things that really are good and healthy and, quite frankly, more sane than the stuff we tend to do to one another. This comes up in Exodus chapter 23. If you look at verses 10 through 13, God is reminding the people that there is a rhythm, a natural rhythm to life, a rhythm where He is in charge. In verse 10 it says, "For 6 years you shall sow the land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and your olive orchard." This was a practice in ancient Jewish understanding, and actually it still exists in some parts of the world, where they work the land for 6 years, and then on the 7th year they leave it fallow. They leave it available for it just to be wild, and so that the nutrients can be restored, and so the goodness can come back to the soil. Anyone who's been a gardener knows that if you continue to work the soil, there's a point when the soil just becomes nothing. It no longer has nutrients to give plants what they need, and those plants then do not bear good fruit. But see, this is where God changes it, right? So God's created an order for how we're supposed to tend our land and how we're supposed to tend the way we work the land for our prosperity. But then in verse 12, He gives it even a little bit bigger push. He says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homebound slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. Be attentive to all that I have said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. If it was so important for God to tend to the land and give order that it could rest to bear good fruit, and it was so important for God to tell His people to rest on the 7th day, so that also the slaves of the house, those who were called to work and serve the family, could also be refreshed. Isn't that the truth for us? Isn't that the truth that we need time to rest? We need time to process. We need time to just be. I love to talk about Sabbath, and you've heard me speak on it a lot. We rest to wake to what God is already doing. That's the reality of Sabbath. We get it wrong. We think that resting is our reward for great work, but if our work is separate from what God's doing, then it really isn't great, is it? But God invokes this idea of resting for caring for the land and caring for the servant, because that's deeply embedded in our identity as His people. In creation, He created all things and then rested with us on the 7th day. As we're created on the 6th day, we literally are created to rest with God. Last week I was at a pastor's conference, and 198 NELC pastors were all gathered together. We were praying together and spending some time in community together. It hasn't happened for a year, so that was kind of a cool thing. And our bishop made a comment at one point that seemingly went unnoticed. The comment of, I know some of the pastors here have not taken a vacation in a year. They feel not worthy because either they have been limited with their in-person worship, or they feel like they're not connecting with people because of a limitation of homebound visits and the ability to connect. Think about that. The bishop acknowledged to the pastors that he knew that there were many in the room who had not rested in a year. How is that a great model? How is that a great model for our congregations and for people of faith? How are we as pastors reflecting on the scriptures? That's what I left with. I wasn't shaming and I'm not judging. I'm just saying, as we think about our rhythms, how are we modeling faith for one another? And that's not just my role for you, that's your role for one another as well. Yesterday I was in this great conversation where the question of evangelism came up. How do Lutherans evangelize? Well, quite frankly, we don't do it well, do we? We're shy, we're embarrassed, we're socially awkward. We don't know how to speak into the feelings of our faith because our faith is somewhat academic. And yet we are called to live into our faith by modeling who God has created us to be, transformed by his word. And so our very existence, our very participation in society should be an example of what we believe and what we practice. And it begins and becomes rooted in chapters like this one in Exodus. We know the law, we know the limitations, but do we also know the invitation? The invitation to rest, to be. The invitation to step back and let God take control and let God be at work. Too often, I think we forget. We keep putting everything on our shoulders, thinking that we're doing this on behalf of God, and yet our expectations for ourselves are even bigger than God's expectations for us. And that's where it becomes dangerous. God gives the law, and in the midst of the law, there is a command to rest, to care for yourself, to allow some space for God to speak in. It's like what I was saying yesterday about driving and sitting on lawnmowers. It creates an opportunity for you to simply just be. And I think we need to be more mindful that in a world that comes at us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we have instant news, we have constant contact with everything that is happening. And so the danger is to become unaware of the limitations we're giving God to speak into our lives. Maybe if we had constant contact from God, right? Maybe if we had an email alert every time God wanted to speak to us, maybe that would grab our attention more. While God is more subtle, God is also more profound. He speaks to our heart. He works in our minds. He turns our eyes and our ears open to things that we might normally completely ignore. And all of that comes when we are grounded in him and his word. My cats are going nuts as they run around the kitchen here. So if you hear the noise in the background, my cats also need to be still. At any rate, it's Wednesday. It's halfway through the week. I hope as you think about the laws that God has given you, if you think about the boundaries that exist in your own life, I hope you also see that there is an incredible invitation, an incredible invitation to create a boundary of life. Life-giving in a restful way. So it's Wednesday. If you need to take a nap this afternoon, take a nap. Rest and know that God is at work in your life. God is leading you and guiding you. God really, really wants to be your God. Have a great day.